Hello, everyone, and welcome to Archaeoviking. Today is the unofficial 19th video and the official 25th video in my series on early U.S. imperial expansion. The subject of today's video is the invasion of Mexico by the United States of America in the Mexican-American War. So, as I always like to do right off the bat, whenever in our modern day hear terms for political entities or geographic regions such as the United States or, say, Mexico, I always like to point out that in our modern minds, we tend to think of these regions as they are today. For example, Mexico as it is seen on this map. And obviously, that makes sense because literally nobody alive has known it any other way. Mexico has had this shape for around 150-ish, going on like 170-ish years. Um, However, while that is correct, it is not the full picture. Um, Mexico only took on this political boundary that you see here after a long series of processes, catalysts, and events. And the same goes for what we now consider the southwestern United States, uh, which includes South California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and Colorado. And the same goes for the states of Wyoming, Oklahoma, and Texas. Now, the reason I'm pointing out all of these states, the southwestern states, California, Nevada, New Mexico, Arizona, etc., as well as Wyoming, Oklahoma, and Texas, is because all of these states are deeply connected in their history to what Mexico once was. Much like Mexico, these states did not always have their territorial boundaries or political boundaries that they have now. They again only took on these political boundaries after a long series of processes, events, and catalysts. So, along with Mexico, in order to better understand how these states took on the shapes that they have today, we need to go back a little bit further in time to get a better look at the broader picture. Starting with Mexico prior to the Mexican American War. So, the deep history of what would eventually lead to the Mexican American War really begins when the Spanish Empire embarked on a campaign of conquest against the Native American nations of Mesoamerica and the North American Southwest between 1521 and 1697 CE. And here's a map showing the broad area that these conquests took place in. And eventually, after these conquests succeeded to varying degrees, the new Spanish province that they had conquered would be named Mexico after Mexico, the Nahuatl term for the heartland of the Triple Alliance, also known as the Aztec Empire. During the early years of these conquests, the Spanish Empire would heavily utilize Native American slavery, specifically from the 1500s to the 1600s CE. With Native American slavery becoming a key part of the Spanish encomienda system, where essentially the encomienda system was, at least on paper, the idea was Spanish settlers would protect and care for and Christianize Native Americans, and then uh, Native Americans would work a portion of their time for Spanish settlers. However, the reality was Spanish settlers would force long labor and didn't pay Native American laborers. They failed to protect the Native Americans and would often seize Native American lands. And also, Native Americans would die from disease and harsh living and working conditions. When news of these abuses of Native Americans reached Spain, Charles V, the King of Spain, and also the Holy Roman Empire, he was specifically called the Holy Roman Emperor, he would create the quote the new laws of the Indies for the good treatment and preservation of the Indians in an attempt to protect Native Americans. Uh, when this law was passed, the encomienda system would be replaced by the repartimiento system. And this would happen specifically on November 20th, 1542 CE. However, despite the attempt to protect Native Americans, repartimiento would become just as brutal as the encomienda system. With the repartimiento system requiring adult male Native Americans to devote a set number of days of labor annually to Spanish economic interests, and this would lead to time limits. With these time limits of work specifically, with these time limits leading some Spanish managers to use their workers in extremely harsh fashion. Essentially, the encomienda system under a different name. Then, as the number of Native Americans would decline and mining activities were replaced by agricultural activities in the 1600s CE, the hacienda, large landed estates in which Native American laborers are directly employed in quasi-feudal-like systems by the hacienda owners, haciendados, would be developed. Uh, then, around the same time as these events were going on, as Native American slavery, the encomienda and repartimiento systems were being utilized, also the hacienda system were being utilized and developed, the Spanish Empire would forcibly import enslaved Africans to their American colonies as part of the transatlantic slave trade between the 1500s and 1820 CE. And here is a graph showing how many enslaved Africans were forcibly shipped to Spanish colonies in the Americas. And here's a bar graph, not a bar graph, a pie graph showing essentially the same thing, the total number of enslaved Africans embarked to the Americas between the 1500s and 1800s CE. And you can see the number of enslaved Africans that were forcibly imported to Spain. Enslaved Africans and African Americans would be forced to work on sugar plantations and in the homes of Spanish aristocrats. Now it is time to talk about Spanish Mexican society. So, Spanish Mexican society was built around a strict caste system known as the casta. The casta would be divided into, at the top, Spaniards born in Spain, known as peninsulares. Then, after that, Spaniards born in Spanish Mexico or other Spanish colonies, known as criollos or creoles, not to be mistaken with the Louisiana Creoles. Then, after the criollos, came individuals of mixed Spanish and Native American descent, known as mestizos. And then after that were individuals of mixed Spanish and African descent, known as mulattoes. Note, this is now an outdated term that should only be used in the way that I'm using it now to talk about the historical context of the Costa. Then, after mulattoes, came Native Americans and Africans, both free and enslaved, who were at the bottom of the Costa system. Poor communities within Spanish Mexico and the subsequent Mexican Republic would develop a culture based on strong and tight knit family units. This would make and still makes the family and family loyalty one of the most important parts of Mexican culture. Spanish Mexican society was, and in many ways still is, divided by strict gender lines, with Spanish Mexican society being largely paternalistic. Men were and still are, in a lot of ways, considered the heads of society, the household, and were and still are expected to be the primary financial providers. At this point in time, men were allowed to punish their wives for acts perceived as misbehavior by using physical punishment. Most women are relegated to being the nurturers of the family, with the Virgin Mary as a model as part of a concept known as Marianismo. However, urban women in Mexico would work in factories, with the earliest being the tobacco factories set up in major Mexican cities as part of the lucrative tobacco monopoly. Women would run a variety of enterprises in Spanish Mexico, with widows of elite businessmen continuing to run the family businesses. Non elite women would also be small scale sellers in markets. Education for women was surrounded by religion, with individuals believing that girls should be educated enough to read the Bible and religious devotionals, and but should not be taught to write. When girls were provided with an education, they would live in convents and be instructed by nuns, with education being significantly limited. However, it should also be said that wealthy women were able to gain a large degree of personal independence and influence. The primary religion of Spanish Mexico was and still is the primary religion of Mexico, that being Catholic Christianity. However, it's important to note that despite attempts to convert the Native American peoples of the North American Southwest and Mesoamerica, the Mesoamerican religion was able to survive. In more urban areas and areas closer to the administrative center of Spanish Mexico, this was done through religious syncretism, or the combining of different religious beliefs, where Native American communities would combine the traditional Mesoamerican religions with Catholic Christianity. Then, in more rural areas and areas further from the administrative center of Spanish Mexico, traditional Mesoamerican religions would remain relatively intact. And here's all the sources that I got this information from. And here is a graph sort of showing what the Costa system of Spanish Mexico looked like. Uh, Another very important thing to point out is that the Native American nations of Mesoamerica and the North American Southwest were never fully conquered, with multiple Native American rebellions against Spanish rule breaking out between 1550 and the 1700s CE. With those including but not being limited to the Chichimeca War, which lasted between 1550 and 1590 CE, the Great Pueblo Revolt, which lasted between 1680 and 1692 CE, and I've already done a video on this that I will include in the iCard. The and I may butcher this and I apologize. The Zeltal Rebellion by the Maya community of the Chiapas region, which lasted between 1712 and 1713 CE, among many others. Also, Native American nations such as the Comanche Nation and the Apache Nation would heavily raid Spanish Mexico for decades before a long-lasting peace would be established, with these raids happening between 1716 and 1786 CE, and this long-lasting peace being established in 1786 CE. Uh, then, inspired by the French and Haitian revolutions, insurgents such as Miguel Hidalgo y Castilla, Ignacio Allende, and Ignacio Lopez Rion uh, would all overthrow Spanish rule between 1810 and 1821 CE, where they would then first establish the First Mexican Empire, which would last just 2 years between 1821 and 1823 CE, with the First Mexican Empire being very quickly replaced by the First Mexican Republic, which would last between 1824 and 1835 CE. And here's a map of the First Mexican Republic here. Then, in 1835 CE, Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna would overthrow the First Mexican Republic and establish the Centralist Republic of Mexico, specifically doing this on October 23rd, 1835 CE. One thing that is very important to point out is that while Federalists in Mexico initially attempted to establish equal rights for Native Americans and African Americans within Mexico, uh, centralist Creole or Criollo aristocrats would hamper these efforts, uh, and would actually leave the casta system of Spanish Mexico largely in place. And yes, the centralists did include, of course, Santa Anna. Uh, Once it was established, the Republic of Mexico, both the Federalist and the Centralist Republic of Mexico, would allow for an investment in industrial enterprises, with women finding increased opportunities to work outside the home, and women increasingly working in factories, working in portable food carts, and increasingly owning their own businesses. However, despite some efforts to industrialize, the Republic of Mexico would be less industrialized than the United States, with agriculture dominating the Republic of Mexico's economy. Now, this brings us to the next section, the United States prior to the Mexican American War. So, as basically, I'm sure basically everyone watching this video knows, the United States of America will form after the British colonies defeated the British Empire in the American Revolution, which happened between 1776 and 1782 CE. And here's a rough map of the American Revolution and its battles. And this is a map of what the United States looked at its inception. Uh, And then after its creation, the United States would begin to expand its territory, often at the expense of Native American nations, with this initial expansion beginning between the 1780s and 1812 CE, um, with the Louisiana Purchase being the sort of first of major uh, uh, move of expansion uh, conducted by the United States. That and also the seizing of what was known as the Old Northwest, which is the Great Lakes region you see here. And here's another map showing all those territories that they were able to uh, annex and purchase during this first wave of expansion, and also conquer. Then, between 1812 and 1815 CE, the United States would go to war against the British Empire in the War of 1812 CE. And here's a map of the War of 1812 CE here. Then, after the War of 1812 CE, the United States would begin to prosper, with its territory and economy continuing to grow during both the era of good feelings and the Jacksonian era, with these happening between 1815 and 1848 CE. Now it is time to look at the society of the United States. So, while the United States was more egalitarian than the Republic of Mexico, the United Society of the United States was and still is in a lot of ways divided by class, gender, and race. Also, while family and family loyalty was and still is to some degree important in the United States, personal independence and self-reliance were and still are far more important in the United States than in Mexico. In the North, social class was divided, and still in a lot of ways is divided into the upper class comprised of industrialists, factory owners, and large landowners, uh, followed by the middle class comprised of educated professionals such as doctors, lawyers, teachers, and small business owners, and then the working class comprised of factory workers, laborers in mills, and other blue collar employees who have little to no access to education and face long hours, low wages, and often poor living conditions. Again, something that is still in a lot of ways present throughout a lot of the United States. In the South, social class was and in a lot of ways still is divided into the planter class, comprised of wealthy plantation owners, or in the modern day farm owners, and enslavers. Then after that were yeoman farmers who owned and farmed small plots of land, but did not own enslaved Africans or African Americans. Then, after that, were poor whites who owned no land and had limited economic opportunities. Uh, and then, after that, were enslaved Africans and African Americans who had no legal rights and were forced to work on plantations as part of the brutal African chattel slavery system. In contrast to the southern and northern states, the western frontier would be relatively egalitarian as land ownership was available to all free men, specifically white American men, with deference for higher social classes tending to fade away as white American frontiersmen were more likely to treat each other as equals, and they would force new levels of political equality for white American men through Jeffersonian democracy and Jacksonian democracy. And the frontier would provide a safety valve whereby discontented Eastern farmers, not individuals from urban areas, uh, could find their own lands. Note how I specifically pointed out white American men, and it's because white American women, Native Americans, African Americans, and any other person of color were not uh, afforded this equality. That being said, women were able to be independent from families and husbands and could work and gain large degrees of social status. However, only white American men had the right to vote. Native Americans, Africans, and African Americans, both enslaved and free, were at the bottom of the social classes of the United States, being unable to vote, having less rights than both white men and women, and were viewed by many white Americans as their racial inferiors. Nationalist views would permeate the United States, leading to the mistreatment of immigrants from countries such as Ireland, Germany, and the British Empire, who were considered inferior to white Americans. This mistreatment was deeply connected to anti Catholic views, particularly in connection to Irish immigrants. And of course, by proxy, uh, in contrast to the Republic of Mexico, the primary religion of the United States was and still is Protestant Christianity. And here are all of the sources that I got that information from. Uh, the economy of the South would be based on agriculture and plantation farming, which of course was built around African chattel slavery as the main driving force of the South. Again, a very brutal institution. That often involved horrific punishments, such as lashing for hours on end, um, among others. And within this system, cotton was the primary cash crop. And here's pictures of individuals harvesting and processing cotton. In contrast, the North was highly urban, with most of the United States' largest cities being located in the North. And this is a picture of Little Five Points, a neighborhood within New York. The North would have an economy based on industrialization and factories. Uh, and then during this time, the United States would become highly industrialized, as seen by inventions such as the telegraph line and railroad systems, which were invented between the 1820s and 1840s CE. Uh, Also, during this time, the United States would forcibly remove Native American nations to west of the Mississippi River between 1817 and the 1840s CE. And here is a map showing all of those various forced removals of Native American nations west of the Mississippi. Here is a more up close version of that, so you can see all the various names of the Native American nations who were forcibly removed. However, it is important to note that multiple Native American nations would fight wars with the United States in response to the forced seizure of their ancestral lands, i.e., they would not essentially lie down and let the United States steal their land and commit genocide. These wars include, but are not limited to, Black Hawk's War in 1832 CE, the Second Creek War, which lasted roughly between 1835 and well into the 1850s CE, and the Second Seminole War, which lasted between 1835 and 1842 CE. In fact, the Second Creek War is often thought of by historians and the Muskogee Creek Nation and the Seminole Nation as really sort of an extension of the Second Seminole War and eventually the Third Seminole War. All right, now this brings us to the background of the Mexican American War. So, with the collapse of the Spanish rule in Mexico, the Republic of Mexico would cease trade with many Native American nations of the North American Southwest. In response, the Native American nations in the North American Southwest would initiate large scale raids of the Republic of Mexico's northern provinces between the 1820s and 1840s CE. And here's a map of the Native American nations of the North American Southwest, as well as northwestern Mexico. And here's another one, another variation of that same map. These raids, Native American raids into the Republic of Mexico, would be initiated by prominent individuals such as Mongus Coloradus of the Membreno Division of the Apache Nation and Iron Jacket of the Quahati Division of the Comanche Nation. Also, Pueblo and Native American nations and communities such as the Hopi and Zuni that had lived under Spanish rule and Mexican rule for centuries would now begin to resist the strict Mexican caste and class system, with many Pueblo and warriors fleeing north to join Native American nations such as the Navajo Nation in raids against Mexico between the 1830s and 1840s CE. And here are some of those Puebloan towns and cities. During this time, the Mexican army would launch multiple failed expeditions to halt these raids, with these resulting in the deaths of multiple Mexican politicians, including Albino Perez, in these expeditions happening between the 1830s and 1840s CE. As a result of this, the raids would leave much of northern Mexico sparsely populated, with Mexican towns in this region being separated by large distances and would be largely undefended by the Mexican army. With this, eventually, the Republic of Mexico would invite white Americans to begin to migrate to Mexican provinces such as Coahuila y Tejas, Nuevo Mexico, and Alta California. White Americans would often intermarry with Mexican citizens and would impose United States cultural values on local communities, with these migrations happening between the 1820s and 1840s CE. And here are the three provinces that the white Americans would specifically migrate to. Also, the Santa Fe Trail would be established between 1820, specifically in 1821. And with the establishment of the Santa Fe Trail, communities within Nuevo Mexico would become dependent on trade with the United States between 1821 and the 1840s CE. Then, with the rise of Santa Anna would disband the Mexican Constitution of 1824 and would disband local militias, which would lead several Mexican provinces to rebel in 1835 CE. And here are some of those provinces that rebelled against Santa Anna's rule here. Of course, Texas being among them. Then also during one of these rebellions, white Americans would defeat the Republic of Texas in the Texas Revolution between 1835 and 1836 CE. And I've already done an in-depth video on the Texas Revolution that I will include in the iCard. That being said, the Republic of Mexico would refuse to acknowledge the independence of the Republic of Texas and would repeatedly invade Texas between 1836 and the 1840s CE. At the same time this was happening, Mexican generals Jose de Urrea and Jose Antonio Mexia would rebel against Santa Anna. However, the rebellion would be quickly defeated, with Urrea being imprisoned and Mexia being executed. That being said, Urrea would later be released to help defend Mexico from an invading French army, with this rebellion happening between 1837 and 1839 CE. Then, uh, between 1838 and 1839 CE, after Mexico rejected demands for financial compensation for the looting of a French citizen's pastry shop in Mexico City, the Kingdom of France would send an army to blockade several Mexican ports and capture the port of Veracruz in what becomes known as the Pastry War. The war would end inconclusively after the British Empire negotiated an end to the conflict in March 1839 CE. After these events, Santa Anna would attempt to restore the treasury of the Republic of Texas by raising taxes. That being said, because of this, several Mexican states would stop dealing with the central government in response, and the provinces of Yucatan and Laredo would declare themselves independent republics, known as the Republic of Yucatan and the Republic of the Rio Grande, respectively. Both republics would be defeated and returned to the Republic of Mexico, with these events happening between 1840 and 1843 CE. Here is a map showing these republics, and there is the Republic of Yucatan and the Republic of the Rio Grande. The constant rebellions, raids by Native American nations, and the Pastry War would leave the economy of Mexico in shambles, leading to rampant poverty within the nation. The Mexican populace and the government, because of this, would begin to resent Santa Anna due to one, his inability to reclaim Texas, and his strict dictatorial rule, which of course is the main reason for the constant rebellions. As a result, Santa Anna would be overthrown by Jose Joaquin de Herrera and would be exiled to Cuba in January 1845 CE. Uh, At the same time, just 1 month later, Mexican cities of Alta California, known as Californios, led by Juan Bautista Alvarado uh, and Jose Castro, along with white American migrants led by John Marsh, would successfully rebel against Mexican rule, replacing the Mexican governor with Alvarado. And this would happen specifically in February 19th and 20th of 1845 CE. Then on December 29th, 1845 CE, Texas would be officially annexed into the United States by President John Tyler. After the annexation of Texas into the United States and the Republic of Mexico would both claim the land between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande, leading to political disputes over the land between 1846 and 1848 CE. During this time, many white Americans would begin to hold heavy anti-Catholic views and would begin to view Mexicans as their racial inferiors and would begin to believe that all Mexican territory should be brought into the United States as part of the philosophy of manifest destiny. And here is a political cartoon from the time in the United States showing anti-Catholic views, and here is a painting showing the concept and philosophy of manifest destiny. Uh, Also, during this time, President James K. Polk and the United States would begin to make plans to obtain not just the disputed parts of Texas, but also Nueva Mexico and Alta California. Now, this brings us to the meat of the video, the Mexican-American War. So, to defend the United States-Mexico border, Polk would dispatch an army of 3,500 soldiers under the command of General Zachary Taylor to Corpus Christi, Texas, to defend the border from possible incursions by the Mexican army in July 1845 CE. At the same time, Polk would dispatch John Slidell to Mexico City to negotiate the purchase of Nueva Mexico, and Alta California, offering $30 million for the provinces. Slidell was also tasked with securing Mexico's agreement to a Rio Grande border. However, Herrera refused to meet with Slidell at all. Then, in December 31st, 1845 CE, General Mariano Paredes would depose Herrera in a military coup, pledging to retake Texas. After these events, hoping to capitalize on the internal weaknesses of the Republic of Mexico and under the assumption that the Republic of Mexico could be intimidated into relinquishing the disputed territory, Polk would dispatch the army under command of General Taylor into the disputed territory. While in the territory, Taylor would construct Fort Brown, with the construction of Fort Brown happening in March of 1846 CE. Shortly after this, in April 25th of 1846 CE, a detachment of 2,000 Mexican cavalry would attack and defeat a 70-man United States patrol commanded by Captain Seth Norton, which had been sent into the contested territory in what would become known as the Thornton Affair. Then, after this skirmish, a Mexican army under the command of Mariano Arista would lay siege to Fort Brown between May 3rd and May 8th of 1846 CE. Taylor and 2,400 soldiers would arrive to relieve the fort, but would be intercepted just 5 miles north of the Rio Grande by Arista and 3,400 Mexican soldiers. However, Taylor would utilize the superior cannons of the United States to defeat Arista in the Battle of Palo Alto, and would be able to defeat Arista after Ulysses S. Grant would successfully lead a group of dragoons in a charge to capture the Mexican army's cannons at the Battle of Resaca de la Palma, with these events happening between May 8th and May 9th of 1846 CE. Then, after these battles, Polk would use the battles as an excuse to declare war on the Republic of Mexico. The United States Congress would eventually approve the declaration of war on May 13th, 1846 CE. As the war began, Polk would order the United States Navy to blockade the Gulf of Mexico. The war would also inflame opposition against the Mexican government. And facing revolution, President Mariano Paredes would resign and would be replaced by Valentin Gomez Farias on July 28th, 1846 CE. Then, in August 6th of 1846 CE, hoping to leverage a negotiation of a treaty, Polk would negotiate a deal with the exiled Santa Anna to sell all the contested territory to the United States at a reasonable price, on the condition that he be allowed back into Mexico through the United States naval blockades. However, upon his return to Mexico, Santa Anna would betray the United States and would quickly gather an army to battle the United States. Okay, now it is time for us to take a look at the United States and Mexican armies at the beginning of the Mexican-American War, starting with the United States Army. So, the United States Army at the start of the Mexican-American War consists of only roughly 6,000 to 10,000 soldiers, but would be increased to 27,000 soldiers at the beginning of the war and would reach roughly 73,000 soldiers at the end of the war. While the United States has fought wars against Native American nations, such as the Second Seminole War and the Second Creek War, the majority of the United States Army is inexperienced in warfare. Serving in the United States Army was often looked down upon by many United States citizens, as joining the Army was viewed as giving up one's independence, an act that is shocking that was shocking in a culture that valued self-reliance. Most of the United States Army consisted of low-class individuals with no economic prospects outside of joining the Army, including poor immigrants from Europe. Furthermore, many joined the Army with the sole goal of journeying to the frontier, where upon arrival many would quickly desert the Army to establish homesteads. Many soldiers in the United States Army would desert during the Mexican American War due to anti immigrant and anti Catholic sentiments in the United States Army, with these deserters often joining the Mexican Army. One example of this is the Irish volunteer unit known as the San Patricio or St. Patrick's Battalion. Supplementing the United States Army were many volunteer units. However, these units rarely followed orders from the Army, often disregarding the orders of officers. Volunteer units were notorious for acting as bandits and committing atrocities against civilians. The United States Army, especially Zachary Taylor's army in northern Mexico, would supplement its force with the mobile paramilitary organization known as the Texas Rangers. Much like the volunteer units, the Texas Rangers were notorious for acting as bandits and committing atrocities against civilians. Now, with all that being said, despite the inexperience of the United States Army had more advanced weapons at its disposals, a larger navy than the Republic of Mexico, and was able to mobilize its heavily industrialized infrastructure to manufacture large amounts of weapons. Now let's take a look at what the United States military looked like at this time. So generally, this is what U.S. infantry units looked like at the onset of the Mexican-American War to some varying degree. Obviously, this individual over here, as you can see here, is a Mexican soldier. Ignore him for the moment. But again, generally, these are what U.S. soldiers or infantrymen look like. And then there were the United States Dragoons, which were the cavalry divisions of the United States Army, which looked something like this, or this, or this. And then there were the United States Navy, which was made up of a variety of different ships, with the most powerful being the steam powered frigates seen here. Now we need to look at the weapons of the United States Army. So, the sidearms of the United States Army, of both the infantrymen and the dragoons, were generally the 1842 CE model percussion pistol, as well as the Colt model 1847 CE revolver. And then the main rifle, the primary weapon of the infantry, was something like the Springfield Model 1842 CE percussion musket or the Model 1841 percussion rifle. And then the infantrymen would be generally equipped with the Model 1832 CE foot artillery sword, and then depending on the individual, especially in volunteer groups, they might be equipped with Bowie knives, as well as being equipped with the Model 1816 bayonet and the Model 1839 CE bayonet, which would, of course, be fixed to the front of the muskets and rifles. And then the officers, as well as the dragoons, would be equipped with the Model 1840 CE light artillery saber. And in terms of cannons, the United States had a variety of modern cannons at their disposal, including the Model 1841 6-pound gun, the Model 1841 CE 12-pounder howitzer, and the Model 1841 CE 24-pounder howitzer. And then when it comes to ships, they had things such as carronade cannons, which were smaller cannons that generally had things like grape shot and shrapnel fired out of it. And they also had the among the most powerful cannons available, the Pichon or Paxson guns, which fired cast iron cannon shot. Now we need to take a look at the Mexican army. So the Mexican army is was generally more experienced than the United States Army due to the need to quell near constant rebellions in the Mexican Republic since the nation's creation in 1824 CE. Also, the Mexican army was larger than the United States Army, consisting of roughly 25,000 soldiers prior to the Mexican American War, doubling to roughly 40,000 soldiers at the beginning of the war and reaching roughly 80,000 soldiers by the end of the war. Also, the Mexican cavalry was generally considered superior to the United States Dragoons, with even the paramilitary Texas Rangers stating that the Mexican cavalry was the superior mounted force. That being said, that's the end of the advantages the Mexican army had over the United States. The Mexican army was poorer than the United States, often facing issues such as providing food, medicine, and clothing for soldiers. Also, the Republic of Mexico was less industrialized, making it far more difficult for the nation to produce enough weapons for its large army. Uh, Much of the Mexican army was comprised of criminals sentenced to military service as a result of crimes, including but not limited to rape, assault, robbery, and unlawful possessions of a weapon. This practice is due to the importance of family and family loyalty in Mexican culture, which would lead to the refusal to send husbands or sons to join the army, an act that would hurt tight knit families who relied on each family member. Similar to the United States, the Republic of Mexico would supplement its forces with volunteer units. However, the volunteer units would often refuse to fight United States forces unless the United States forces were close to their families or hometowns. The Mexican army was also equipped with outdated Napoleonic era weapons purchased from European powers who often purposefully sold Mexico outdated weaponry. The Mexican Navy was also significantly smaller than the United States Navy. And here are all the sources that I got that information from. Now let's take a look at what the various parts of the Mexican army look like. Starting with the Mexican infantry, which looked generally something like this here. And then there was also the Mexican cavalry, which looked generally something like this here, or these here, depending on the region. Also, these here. And then there was of course, the Mexican Navy, which was generally made up of brigantines and schooners. Uh, it's important to note that brigantines and schooners were also used by the United States Navy. However, the United States Navy was very much able to utilize the powerful steam-powered frigates, something which the Mexican Navy did not have. Now let's take a look at the weapons of the Mexican army. So generally, the infantry of the Mexican army used British Baker rifles, also known as the pattern model 1800 CE infantry rifle, and the British Brown Bess, also known as the British land pattern muskets. Both of which were really well designed muskets during the Napoleonic era, but of course, at this point in time, they were very much outdated. Then when it comes to sidearms, the Mexican army would generally use something like a Spanish Miquelet pistol from the Napoleonic era, and the Mexican infantry would also be equipped with the Mexican short saber. And then in terms of the cavalry, the Mexican cavalry would be equipped with the Mexican cavalry carbine, as well as being equipped with the Mexican cavalry lance and the model 1822 CE cavalry saber. Uh, In terms of cannons, the Mexican army had at its disposal uh, earlier dated, outdated 3-pounder cannons and 4-pounder cannons, as well as 6-pounder cannons and 8-pounder cannons, all from the Napoleonic era. And that being said, the Mexican Navy did have access and did use Pichon or Paxson guns. However, their Paxson guns uh, used cannon shot that was cast with copper, so making it far less powerful than the iron shot of the United States Paxson Pichon guns, um, and also far more prone to shatter than those from the Paxson guns of the United States. All right, now this brings us to our next section, women in the Mexican-American War, starting with Mexican women. So during the war, the Mexican army utilized a traditional support system for troops, women known as soldaderas. These women were often the wives of soldiers and volunteers. They would provide health care, food, and companionship to soldiers. Most did not participate in conventional fighting on battlefields, but some soldaderas did join battles alongside the men. These women were involved in fighting during the defense of Mexico City and Monterrey. Among these was a woman by the name of Maria Josefa Zozaya. Also, Mexican women were able to do more than what was expected of them domestically. Though they were not ideal circumstances, the war gave Mexican women the opportunity to find independence within the public sphere. Mexican women would display their pride in defense of their country. Mexican women would create their own forms of propaganda, and despite their losses in the war, Mexican women would still risk their lives in public in order to display their patriotism, as seen in this excerpt from a poem titled "When Women Oppose the Cowardly Men." And you can pause and read that poem here. Then, now it is time to look at white American women during the Mexican American War. So, most white American women did not participate in the war's battles. However, there were notable white American women who did participate in battle. Much like the Mexican women, they were mostly recognized for their work as providing medical care, laundresses, and cooks. One notable woman was Sarah Brown, who would often transport wounded soldiers to healthcare workers within forts. She would also refuse to take shelter and would serve food and water to the troops during the siege of Fort Brown. Her determination during the siege would earn her the nickname the Heroine of Fort Brown and the honorary title of Colonel Bowman. She would travel with Taylor's army as a nurse and a cook and would participate in the Battle of Buena Vista. In the United States, white American were able to contribute from across the border, such as crafting art, flags, and quilts to display their patriotism, passing on to their husbands and sons who had enlisted. However, many white American women would also take the opportunity to manage their businesses in the absence of men, as well as protesting their concerns publicly. Also, wanting to make their voices heard within the public sphere, some American women would take advantage of their literacy to reach headlines across multiple states. Prior to the war, New England industries had already expanded into Mexican territory. Therefore, American couples had already made the move to reside in Mexico. When American women were abandoned by their husbands to fight in the war, they were left to uphold the factories. Thus, factory women held supervising positions as well as labor jobs, especially in the textile industry. One of these women was Anne Chase. As American citizens were told to evacuate Tampico, Chase was left to run her husband's business alone as she was exempted due to her British citizenship. Towards the beginning of the war, She was bombarded with increased pressures from Mexican officials to shut down her businesses and move away. With resentment towards the war, Chase would begin to send information to United States Navy troops on the whereabouts of Mexican troops. Now, this brings us to our next section, the opposition to the war. So, uh, during this point in time, a great many people opposed going to war with Mexico. Among these were prominent abolitionists such as Frederick Douglass, William Lloyd Garrison, uh, as well as prominent transcendentalists Henry David Thoreau and Ralph Waldo Emerson, who would oppose the war because they believed that the war had been started illegally and that the conquest of Mexico would expand the institution of African chattel slavery into Mexico. Also, many American women, such as Jane Swisshelm and Anne Royale, would work as journalists to protest the war. Swisshelm opposed the war as she viewed it as illegal and an attempt to spread African chattel slavery. Royale protested the war as she believed the United States was too large and unmanageable. Both women denounced the actions of American soldiers and volunteers who would often rape and murder Mexican women. Both Royale and Swisshelm became vessels for the voices of those in the opposition of the war. In addition to these individuals, many Whig politicians, such as Henry Clay, John Quincy Adams, and a young Abraham Lincoln, would oppose the war, viewing it as a ploy to expand African chattel slavery and seeing it as a conflict that would overextend the United States. Initially, Clay did not publicly oppose the war. However, after his son, Henry Clay Jr., died in the Battle of Buena Vista, Clay publicly attacked the war and President Polk. Lincoln's opposition to the war was ignored in both Congress and the national papers, and it cost him political support in his home district. One Illinois newspaper derisively nicknamed him Spotty Lincoln. Lincoln later regretted some of his statements, and all of these events nearly cost Lincoln his political career. Now, obviously, it didn't because he later went on to become president of the United States, but still. Also, in addition to the Whigs, a large minority of Jacksonian Democrats, such as John C. Calhoun, would oppose the war because they feared that the addition of Mexican territory to the United States would lead to the abolition of African chattel slavery by adding more free states to the United States, and because the Republic of Mexico had already abolished African chattel slavery. Uh, Also, many Jacksonian Democrats held racist views that, uh, based on the idea that allowing Mexican citizens and Native Americans into the United States would undermine the United States and would dilute white American society. That being said, there was a large amount of support for the war. Despite the opposition of John C. Calhoun and other Jacksonian Democrats, most Jacksonian Democrats, such as Sam Houston, Thomas Jefferson Rusk, and Stephen A. Douglas, would support going to war with Mexico and the potential of the addition of Mexican territory to the United States. Uh, Also, in addition to this, thousands of United States citizens, especially in the Western frontier and the South, would support the war, and they would go on to volunteer to join state militias to fight in the war. Now, this brings us to our next section, United States journalism during the Mexican American War. So, thanks to the invention of the telegraph, news from the war was able to quickly spread, or more quickly spread, to the United States. The news would be reported in news outlets such as the penny press. The news from the war would allow journalists such as George Wilkins Kendall to report on the war with information from reporters on the scene, and would allow artists such as Carl Nebel to paint depictions of actual events during the war. All right, now this brings us to our first major military campaign of the Mexican American War. Now, before I get into that, I do want to state that from this point forward in the video, none of the events are going to be necessarily in chronological order. And that's because a lot of the events and battles within these various military campaigns took place at the exact same time or close to the same time. So it is therefore easier to explain the events of the Mexican American War by dividing these events up into the specific military campaigns they took place in. All right, so with that in mind, let us take a look at the New Mexico campaign of the Mexican American War. In June of 1846 CE, General Stephen Kearny would be dispatched to Nueva Mexico with an army of 1,700 soldiers known as the Army of the West. As Nuevo Mexico had few Mexican soldiers to defend it, the Mexican garrison would refuse to battle the Army of the West, which would allow Kearny to take Santa Fe and Nuevo Mexico without firing a single shot. Kearny would then declare himself the military governor of the New Mexico territory and would establish a civilian government, with these events happening between August 9th and August 15th of 1846 CE. Kearny and the Army of the West, at this point in time, presented themselves to the Mexican citizens in the territory as saviors arriving to save the Mexican citizens from raiding Native American nations. However, most of the army would quickly leave to join American forces in Alta California, with Kearny leaving only a small American force under the command of Charles Bent within the territory. Uh, with Kearny and his force departing on September 22nd, 1846 CE. The Mexican and Native American citizens of Nueva Mexico would then be mistreated by the United States forces in the territory due to the heavy anti Mexican and anti Native American beliefs of the white American soldiers. As a result, large numbers of Mexicans and Native American Puebloans from Taos Pueblo would begin an insurrection against the United States forces by attempting to assassinate Bent. The insurrection would become known as the Taos Revolt, with it breaking out specifically on January 19th of 1847 CE. The Mexican and Puebloan forces would kill multiple United States officials and Mexican officials working with the United States. Afterward, the Mexican and Puebloan forces would lay siege to and destroy a mill and distillery owned by a white American named Simon Turley, which was only defended by 8 white American mountain men. And then they would go on to kill 8 white American traders near the village of Mora, making a total of 16 white Americans, with this happening on January 20th, 1847 CE. In response to the attacks, Colonel Sterling Price would lead roughly 500 United States soldiers to attack Taos Pueblo. En route to Taos Pueblo, Sterling's forces would defeat a force of roughly 2,000 Mexicans and Puebloans in the Battle of Cañada, and a force of roughly 700 Mexican and Puebloans in the Battle of Embudo Pass, with this happening between January 24th and 29th of 1847 CE. While Price's force marched towards Taos Pueblo, a separate force of 80 United States soldiers would attack the village of Mora and would be defeated by a force of roughly 200 Mexicans and Puebloans in the First Battle of Mora. However, a larger force of 200 United States soldiers would attack and defeat the Mexicans and Puebloan forces in the Second Battle of Mora. The United States forces would kill stragglers, loot and burn villages, including Mora, the nearby ranches, the wheat fields, and other crops surrounding the settlements. The Mexican and Puebloan forces would flee to the nearby mountains, staying in these hamlets for some time due to crop and livestock destruction by the United States, which left them with no food source. And these battles would happen between January 24th and February 1st, 1847 CE. And here is a picture of these battles. Price's force would then go on to lay siege to Taos Pueblo and defeat its defending force of roughly 700 Mexicans and Puebloans. After the siege of Taos, Price would hold a mock trial, declaring 15 men, including Pablo Montoya, a leader of the insurrection, guilty of murder and treason, and would go on to execute them on February 7th, 1847 CE. Uh, there is an eyewitness account of the event described by a white American writer named Louis Hector Garrard. In it, he says, and I quote, "It certainly did not appear to be a great assumption of the part of the Americans to conquer a country and then arraign them, the revolting inhabitants, for treason. American judges sat on the bench, New Mexicans and Americans filled the jury box, and American soldiery guarded the halls. Verily, a strange mixture of violence and justice, a strange middle ground between martial and common law. After an abuse of a few minutes, the jury returned with a verdict: guilty in the first degree. 5 for murder, 1 for treason. Treason indeed. What did the poor devil know about his new allegiance? I left the room sick at heart. Justice. Out upon the word when its distorted meaning is a warrant for murder those who defended to their last country and their last homes." As you can see, Garrard did not have a high opinion of the Americans uh, holding this trial of the Pueblo and Mexican citizens. And here is the source that I got this quote from. And here is Pablo Montoya, and here is a graveyard at Taos Pueblo, including those individuals who were executed for treason. Despite the defeat at Taos Pueblo, the Mexican and Puebloan forces would continue to battle the occupying United States forces. A force of United States soldiers under the command of Major Edmondson would be ambushed and defeated by a force of 500 Mexicans and Puebloans in the Battle of Red River Canyon on May 26, 1847 CE. In response to the repeated attacks, Edmondson's force uh, would attack and defeat the Mexican Puebloan forces in the Battle of Las Vegas and in the Battle of Cienega Creek. This would officially end the Taos Revolt and would secure Nueva Mexico for the United States, though raids by Native American nations such as the Navajo Nation, Apache Nation, and Comanche Nation would continue. The end of the Taos Revolt in the firmly securing of Nueva Mexico for the United States would happen between July 6th and 9th of 1847 CE. Now this brings us to our next section, the California Campaign. In December 9th, between December 9th, 1845 and February of 1846 CE, Major John C. Fremont would enter California, leading a survey expedition of 60 white American volunteer militia and Native American scouts. After resupplying at Monterey, California, not to be mistaken for a different city known as Monterey within Mexico itself, Fremont's force would have a tense standoff with a larger Mexican force led by Mexican Commandant Jose Castro before Fremont would withdraw north to march to Oregon. Upon arriving at Lassen Ranch in the upper Sacramento Valley, Fremont's forces would meet white Americans who claimed that an encampment of 1,000 Native Americans was preparing to attack white settlements. Fremont would then move his men up the Sacramento River in search of the Native Americans, with this encounter with white Americans happening on March 30th, 1846 CE. Upon reaching Redding's Ranch, Fremont's force would find a large village of the Wintu Nation on April 5th, 1846 CE. Fremont would then order an advance on the Wintu village, advancing from 3 sides on the Wintu, who were unable to flee the camp as the majority of their ranks were women and children, and they were pinned against the river. The men of the Wintu camp formed a defensive line with the women and children behind them. Fremont would order his force to give no quarter and would promptly slaughter an estimated 900 Wintu men, women, and children in an event that would become known as the Sacramento River Massacre, with this massacre happening on April 5th, 1846 CE. There are eyewitnesses' accounts of this massacre, of which there are several excerpts I have here. With excerpt one being from the first two excerpts coming from the memoirs of Thomas E. Breckinridge. Excerpt one reads, and I quote, the settlers charged into the village, taking the warriors by surprise, and then commenced a scene of slaughter which is unequaled in the West. The bucks, squaws, and papooses were shot down like sheep, and those men never stopped as long as they could find one alive. I think that I hate an Indian, except two says, and I quote, I think that I hate an Indian as badly as anybody and have as good a reason to hate them, but I don't think that I could have assisted in that slaughter. It takes two to fight or quarrel, but in that case, there was but one side fighting and the other side trying to escape. And then the next excerpt comes from Kit Carson's own story of his life, which reads, and I quote, during our stay at Lawson's, some Americans were settled in the neighborhood, uh, came in stating that there were about 1,000 Indians in the vicinity making preparations to attack these settlements, requested assistance of Fremont to drive them back. He and a party of some few Americans that lived near started for the American encampment. Found them to be in great force, as was stated. They were attacked. The number killed I cannot say. It was a perfect butchery. Those not killed fled in all directions and returned to Lawson's. Had accomplished what we went for and given the Indians such a chastisement that it would be a long before they ever again would feel like attacking the settlements. And as you can see from these sources, this was a horrific event, with obviously Kit Carson being far more proud of the event, while Thomas E. Breckinridge was very clearly horrified by the event. And here are these sources that I took these things from. After the Sacramento River Massacre, Fremont's force would move along the Upper Klamath Lake. Fremont's force would kill any Native American they encountered. While camped at Upper Klamath Lake, Lieutenant Archibald Giuseppe would arrive from Washington, D.C., delivering a dispatch to Fremont that informed him of the outbreak of the Mexican-American War, and ordered Fremont to invade Alta California, with Fremont receiving these orders on May 8th, 1846 CE. In response to Fremont's attacks, roughly 20 warriors from the Klamath Nation would ambush Fremont's force on Upper Klamath Lake and would kill 3 of Fremont's volunteers on May 9th, 1846 CE. In retaliation for the ambush, Fremont would send Kit Carson to lead an attack on a Klamath village. Carson and his volunteers would kill 14 Klamath in the village in an event known as the Klamath Lake Massacre on May 12th, 1846 CE. Fremont's force would then re-enter Alta California, resupplying at Lassen Ranch before moving to capture Sutter's Fort on May 31st, 1846 CE. On the way to Sutter's Fort, Fremont would camp near the Bear and Feather Rivers. While camped, Fremont would hear rumors that a local village of the Patwan people of the Wintu Nation were preparing to attack the settlers in the area. In reality, the village was preparing to harvest its crops. Fremont would take the movements of the Native Americans and the upcoming harvest as, quote, signs that the time for the attack was nearing. and would state in his memoirs that he chose to attack them preemptively, killing several Patwin villagers in an event that would become known as the Sutter's Buttes Massacre in June of 1846 CE. In fact, it's important that we take a look at Fremont's personal account of the Sutter's Buttes massacre, which reads, and I quote, "It was evident from the movements of the Indians that the rumored attack on the settlers was certainly intended. All signs indicated that the time for it was at hand. The wheat throughout the valley was now dry and ready for the harvest or the torch. Keeping in mind my promises to the settlers, and being now about to move towards Sutter's Forts, where I intended to occupy a more central position, I thought that the time for me too had come. I resolved to anticipate the Indians and attack them, a blow which would make them recognize that Castro was far and that I was near. And I judged it expedient to take such precautionary measures as in my forward movement would leave no enemy behind to destroy the strength of my position by cutting off my supply and cattle and break communication with incoming immigrants. Accordingly, early in the morning, I moved quietly out of camp with the greater number of men, taking the right or western bank of the Sacramento. In describing the lower division of this river, I have already mentioned that many rancherias towards the head of its valley. Some of the largest were scattered along the right bank of the river, where fish and abundant acorn-bearing trees made a preferred ground. These numbered more men than the smaller rancherias which lay further out in the valley among the hills. My movement was unexpected, and riding rapidly up the river, we reached without discovery the first rancheria among the hostiles. The scouts who had been sent forward reported the Indians with feathers on their heads and faces painted black, their war color, and in the midst of their war ceremonies. Intending to surprise and scare them, we rode directly upon them, and at this place several Indians were killed in the dispersion. In the panic made by our sudden charge, the Indians jumped into and swam the river, a few escaping into shelter on our side of the river. With scarcely a halt, we rode on towards the other rancherias, but the news of our attack apparently reached these as soon as ourselves, for the Indians were escaping from their villages as we rode in among them. Before the close of the day, nearly all the rancherias had been visited and the Indians dispersed. As we rode down the hill which commanded a view of the river plain on which stood the farthest village that we reached, we could see the Indians in commotion, and some running off from the river and others jumping into it. When we reached the rancheria, the water was dotted with the heads of the Indians swimming across. We had surprised them assembled in the height of their war ceremonies. This put an end to the intended attack on the whites. The Indians of the California Valley had their fixed places of habitation where they lived. The tribes on one river were rarely friendly to those on the other. They knew that I came from the mountains, so they could not take refuge there. That if I should drive them into the upper valley, they would encounter hostile tribes who would destroy them, so that with the return of their villages, the dread of another visitation would keep them on their good behavior. This was a rude but necessary measure to prevent the injury to the whites, and it had the effect which I intended. So, as you can see here, Fremont very clearly wanted to make an example of the Native American peoples of this region, of the Patwin peoples of the Wintu Nation. While these events were happening, 30 white American rebels would stage a revolt in response to government threats of expulsion and would seize control of the small Mexican Sonoma barracks garrison. There, they would form the California Republic and would create the quote bear flag and raise it over Sonoma between June 8th and June 14th of 1846. Fremont's force would quickly join the white American rebels and would seize Sutter's Fort on June 15th, 1846 CE. Fremont's force and the rebels would move south, searching for Captain Joaquin de la Torre and his lancers, rumored to have been ordered by Castro to attack Sonoma, but they would be unable to find them. While searching, Fremont would order Kit Carson to attack and murder three unarmed men on the shores of San Rafael, with these men including the sons of Francisco de Haro, with these events happening on June 26th and June 28th, 1846 CE. Meanwhile, Commodore John Drake Sloat would be put in charge of the United States Pacific Fleet, including ships such as the USS Savannah. The Pacific Fleet would then go on to defeat the Mexican army at the Battle of Monterrey. Again, not to be mistaken for a different Battle of Monterrey that I will talk about later in the video. And the Battle of Yerba Buena, also a town now known as San Francisco. The Pacific Fleet would easily capture both cities as the small, unsupplied garrisons did not fire their cannons as they feared being obliterated by the United States' superior cannons. The United States would seize these cities between July 7th and July 9th of 1846 CE. Sloat would then dissolve the California Republic before transferring command of the Pacific Fleet to Robert F. Stockton, who would order Fremont to gather volunteers and create the California Battalion, with these events happening between July 9th and July 15th of 1846 CE. In southern Alta California, the Mexican army would defeat the United States Army in multiple battles, such as the Siege of Los Angeles, as the United States garrisons left by Stockton were too small, and the Mexican army was able to trick the United States garrison into thinking that they were better armed than they actually were, with these battles happening between September and October of 1846 CE. After entering Alta California, Stephen Kearny and the Army of the West would battle the Mexican army to a stalemate in the Battle of San Pascual. Later, Stockton would send Kearny reinforcements, and Kearny would later defeat the Mexican army in the Battle of Rio San Gabriel, utilizing the United States howitzers to great effect, with these battles happening between December 1846 and January 1847 CE. The United States Army would defeat the Mexican army in the Battle of Santa Clara and the Battle of La Mesa, both times leveraging the United States howitzers to bombard the Mexican forces, with these battles happening between January 2nd and 9th of 1847 CE. Fremont would then be promoted to brigadier general and would negotiate with Andres Pico to end the California campaign with the Treaty of Cahuenga on January 13th, 1847 CE. Now this brings us to our next section, the Pacific Coast Campaign. So the United States Navy would blockade the Gulf of California several times between 1846 and 1847 CE. Despite initial defeats at the hands of the Mexican army due to insufficient forces, the United States Navy would defeat the Mexican army in several battles, including the Battle of San Jose del Cabo and the Siege of La Paz between November and December of 1847 CE. After defeating the Mexican army in the region, the United States Navy would occupy the Mexican province of Baja California. Now this brings us to the next campaign, the Northern Mexico Campaign. Zachary Taylor would lead an army of 2,300 United States soldiers into New Mexico to lay siege to the city of Monterrey. Before reaching Monterrey, Taylor would occupy the cities of Matamoros and Camargo, where he would gather more United States soldiers to make his force roughly 6,000 United States soldiers, volunteers, and Texas Rangers. While marching to Monterrey, many United States soldiers would die of diseases such as dysentery, malaria, yellow fever, typhoid fever, smallpox, and measles due to poor sanitation conditions in the camps, which would lead to widespread outbreaks of these infectious diseases. With the march to Monterrey happening between May and September of 1846 CE. Taylor's force would then begin to lay siege to Monterrey. In the initial siege, the United States cannons proved inadequate to breach the walls, forcing the United States Army to attack with a frontal assault on the city under heavy fire from the city's defenders, with this happening on September 21st, 1846 CE. Among Monterey's defenders are the Irish St. Patricios, also known as the St. Patrick's Battalion. Upon breaching the city, the United States Army began to march straight down the open streets of the city, where they were annihilated by Mexican defenders well hidden in Monterey's thick adobe homes. This was due to the United States' inexperience in urban warfare. This would lead the more experienced Texas Rangers to advise Taylor that the United States soldiers needed to mouse hole by punching holes in the side or roofs of the homes and fight hand to hand inside the structures. Mexican citizens would then call the Texas Rangers the Diabolicos Tejanos, the Devil Texans. This method would prove successful. The United States would then drive and trap the Mexican army led by Pedro de Ampudia into the city's central plaza, where howitzer shelling would force Ampudia to negotiate the surrender of Monterrey to Taylor's forces on September 24th, 1846 CE. Taylor would agree to allow the Mexican army to evacuate and to an 8-week armistice in return for the surrender of the city. However, Taylor would break the armistice and would occupy the city of Saltillo, southwest of Monterrey. Blaming Taylor for suffering heavy losses and failing to imprison Ampudia's entire force, Polk would strip Taylor's force of most of its soldiers in order to support the coming coastal operations against Veracruz and the Mexican heartland. Meanwhile, further north, Colonel Alexander William Doniphan would sign the Bear Springs Treaty with the Navajo Nation, the Ute Nation, the Zuni Nation, and the Hopi Nation, ending large-scale raids by these nations on November 21st, 1846 CE. And here are all these nations that I mentioned here. Doniphan would then lead a force of roughly 800 United States dragoons to defeat the Mexican army at the Battle of El Bracito on December 26th of 1846 CE. Receiving news of the reduction of Taylor's force, Santa Anna would seize the opportunity to march 20,000 Mexican soldiers north, hoping to crush Taylor's force. However, Santa Anna's force had little food or medicine, was malnourished, and equipped with damaged or inadequate clothing for the desert. As a result, Santa Anna's force suffered from desertions during the long march and arrived with only 15,000 men in a tired state on February 22nd, 1846 CE. Santa Anna's army would meet Taylor's force at Buena Vista, with Taylor's force entrenched in a narrow mountain pass called La Angostura, or the Narrows, several miles south of Buena Vista Ranch. A volunteer regiment known as the Mississippi Rifles, led by Jefferson Davis, would form a V formation around Taylor's forces, providing an entrenched position. Santa Anna would demand Taylor's force to surrender, but Taylor would refuse, with this happening on February 22nd, 1847 CE. Santa Anna would then flank Taylor's position by sending his cavalry and some of his infantry up the steep terrain that made up one side of the pass, while a division of infantry attacked the front of Taylor's force to distract and draw out the United States forces along the road leading to Buena Vista. Santa Anna's force nearly broke Taylor's defensive lines several times, but their infantry columns navigating the narrow pass suffered heavily from the United States howitzers, which fired point-blank canister shots to break up the attacks. The battle ended inconclusively, with both sides suffering heavy casualties and claiming victory. Believing his army was on the verge of exhaustion and collapse due to lack of provisions, Santa Anna withdrew his force and ended the Battle of Buena Vista on February 23rd, 1846 CE. And here is a picture of that battle here and here. All right, now this brings us to our next section, the Central Mexico Campaign. General Winfield Scott was placed in charge of a United States Army of 12,000 soldiers and volunteers. Scott's forces would then lay siege to the city of Veracruz, bombarding the walls and buildings of the city with howitzers and naval cannons. This would demoralize the city's defenders, who would surrender after 12 days. Taylor's force only suffered 80 casualties, while the city's defenders suffered 180 casualties. In addition to this, hundreds of civilians within the city were killed or injured. Many of the casualties in Taylor's force were due to yellow fever. The siege of Veracruz was a crushing victory for the United States, with the siege happening between March 17th and 29th of 1847 CE. As he was from Veracruz, Santa Anna allowed Scott's force to march inland, expecting yellow fever and other tropical diseases to take their toll before he chose a place to engage Scott's force. Meanwhile, he drew on local resources to feed his hungry army and used a network of allies to gain intelligence on the enemy's movements. Santa Anna chose Cerro Gordo as the place to engage Scott's force, calculating the terrain would offer him the maximum advantage for the Mexican forces and that it would neutralize the effectiveness of the United States howitzers. He would set up a defensive position in a canyon around the main road and would prepare fortifications and have cannons trained on the road where he expected Scott's force to appear, with these fortifications being built around April 2nd, 1847 CE. However, Scott had dispatched 2,600 dragoons to scout ahead, and the Mexican cannons prematurely fired on them, revealing their positions, initiating the battle. Instead of taking the main road, Scott's forces marched through the rough terrain to the north and set up his howitzers on high ground, quietly flanking the Mexican army. This left the Mexican army unprepared for the devastation caused by the United States howitzers. 1,000 Mexican soldiers died in the onslaught. To save his force, Santa Anna retreated from the battlefield, allowing the United States to win the Battle of Cerro Gordo on April 18th, 1847 CE. Scott's force would then march to the city of Pueblo, which surrendered without a shot fired as the inhabitants were demoralized by the Battle of Cerro Gordo. Scott would then gather supplies and reinforcements at Puebla and send back units whose enlistments had expired. Leaving only a small garrison at Puebla to protect the sick and injured recovering there, Scott would advance on Mexico City with his remaining force on August 7th, 1847 CE. In preparation for Scott's forces, Santa Anna ordered General Gabriel Valencia to set up defensive fortifications at the outskirts of Mexico City. However, Valencia would defy his orders and would move his force to the lava fields of Contreras, believing them impassable. However, Scott ordered engineering officers such as Robert E. Lee and George B. McClellan to build a road across the lava field. This would surprise Valencia's army, which was routed, with Scott's force capturing 22 Mexican cannons, 4 generals, and 843 soldiers taken prisoner. The Battle of Contreras was an overwhelming victory for the United States, with this battle happening between August 19th and 20th, 1847 CE. After the Battle of Contreras, Santa Anna would order several Mexican generals to retreat to Churubusco and other neighborhoods on the outskirts of Mexico City. 2 battalions, including the San Patricios, St. Patrick's Battalion, were tasked with defending the convent within Churubusco, while earthworks and 7 cannons were placed on the south bank of the Churubusco River, and Santa Anna formed a reserve along the highway to the north. However, several brigades from Scott's force would flank the Mexican defenders, capturing a Mexican general and 4 cannons. This would force most of the defenders to withdraw to Mexico City. After the withdrawal of most of Santa Anna's force to Mexico City, Scott ordered his force to assault the convent within Churubusco. The San Patricios, St. Patrick's Battalion, would defend the convent and make a final stand against Scott's forces. The San Patricios St. Patrick's Battalion would kill 139 United States soldiers and would wound 865, nearly winning the battle. It was only after they ran out of ammunition that they would be finally overtaken, with 35 being killed, 85 being captured, and 85 escaping to Mexico City. The San Patricios St. Patrick's Battalion would lose 60% of its soldiers in the battle, ending the hard-fought Battle of Churubusco in a victory for the United States on April 20th, 1847 CE. After the Battle of Churubusco, 72 of the San Patricios St. Patrick's Battalion were court-martialed by the United States Army as deserters. 50 would be sentenced to hang, having deserted after the war had been declared. Those who deserted earlier received 50 lashes, with these trials happening with these court-martials happening between August 23rd and 26th, 1847 CE. After the Battle of Contreras and the Battle of Churubusco, an armistice would be declared, temporarily ending the fighting. This would allow reinforcements to join Scott's force, swelling the force to roughly 20,000 soldiers. Believing that a cannon foundry was located at the Molino del Rey, known as the King's Mill, located just 2 miles outside of Mexico City, Scott would order William J. Worth to attack and destroy the foundry. Worth's force was able to take the Molino del Rey after heavy fighting, with both sides taking heavy casualties. However, Worth's force was only able to find and destroy a few cannon molds. This would make the Battle of Molino del Rey a Pyrrhic victory at best for the United States, with this battle happening on September 8th, 1847 CE. For those of you who don't know what this is, a Pyrrhic victory is essentially a victory that is so costly it might as well be a defeat. As the city was guarded in part by Chapultepec Castle, which was also being used as a military academy, Scott ordered 2,000 United States soldiers to assault the castle. The assault lasted 2 days, with both the United States soldiers and the Mexican garrison losing roughly half their forces in the assault. Most of the Mexican garrison would retreat to Mexico City. However, 6 cadets from the military academy would refuse to retreat, instead choosing to fight to the death. These cadets would be immortalized in Mexico as Los Niños Heroes, or the Boy Heroes. Similar to the Battle of Molino del Rey, the Battle of Chapultepec Castle was a Pyrrhic victory at best for the United States, with this battle happening between September 12th and 13th, 1847 CE. Scott would then order his force to begin the siege of Mexico City by assaulting the Belen Gate and the San Cosme Gate, with heavy fighting ensuing, with Scott's forces and the Mexican defenders often reaching stalemates thanks to Santa Anna and other Mexican generals coming to the gates to relieve the defenders. It was only after individuals such as Ulysses S. Grant relocated howitzers to the tops of buildings and began firing on the defenders that the tide of the battle began to change. Both gates fell, and the Mexican garrisons withdrew into Mexico City on September 14th, 1847 CE. Santa Anna and most of the Mexican army would flee Mexico City during the night. In addition to this, Santa Anna would release 30,000 prisoners into the streets. As Scott's force entered the city, the remnants of the Mexican army within the city and the prisoners would fire on Scott's force from the rooftops. However, Scott's force would eventually be able to get these attacks under control and would officially capture Mexico City on September 15th, 1847 CE. Santa Anna would make one last attempt to defeat the United States Army by cutting them off from the coast, where Santa Anna would lay siege to the United States occupied city of Puebla. However, he was not able to provision his troops, and the Mexican army laying siege to Puebla effectively dissolved as a fighting force to forage for food. A relief force of roughly 3,000 United States soldiers would arrive, lifting the siege and later defeating Santa Anna at the Battle of Huamantla. Santa Anna's force would retreat to the countryside, and these would be the last major battles Santa Anna and the Mexican army would fight in the war, with these battles happening between September 14th and October 12th, 1847 CE. Now this brings us to our next section, rebellions against the Republic of Mexico during the Mexican-American War. During this time, many Mexican generals, such as Juan Alvarez, and Mexican provinces such as the province of Jalisco, would refuse to send supplies or soldiers to Santa Anna, which would greatly undermine the Mexican. Then, after the Mexican government decided to nationalize church lands and sell them for 15 million pesos, multiple revolts and violent riots would break out throughout Mexico in opposition to this measure. These would culminate in a group of rebels led by Jose Mariano Salas to launching a coup against Mexican President Valentin Gomez Farias. Santa Anna would side with the rebels and would help install Pedro Maria de Anya as the new president of Mexico. This event would become known as the Revolt of the Pocos, with this revolt happening between February 26th and March 23rd of 1847 CE. In addition to this, multiple Native American communities in the Mexican provinces of Nayarit, Jalisco, and Veracruz would initiate multiple rebellions with the goal of reseizing their ancestral lands held by wealthy Mexican families, with all of these rebellions happening sometime in November of 1847 CE. And here is Nayarit, Jalisco, and Veracruz. The largest of these Native American revolts against Mexican authority and the seizure of their ancestral lands was initiated by Maya communities in the Yucatan Peninsula. Seen here. Known as the Caste War, the rebellion began as a response to the seizure of Maya lands by wealthy Mexican landowners for the production of agave, as well as the oppressive taxation of Maya communities and the sacking of multiple Maya towns thought to be planning rebellions. The Maya rebels would attack all Mexican settlements in the Yucatan, would drive out most of the Mexican garrisons present, and would seize control of most of the peninsula between 1847 and 1848 CE. Now this brings us to our next section, Mexican guerrilla warfare against the United States. While both during and after the main campaigns within Mexico itself, Mexican generals such as Jose de Urrea would use Mexican Lancer cavalry to harass United States patrols and supply lines to great effect, making off with supplies and killing many United States soldiers. Any United States soldier or small groups of United States soldiers who left the safety of the United States camps would be attacked and killed by Mexican Lancers and other guerrilla groups. Also, the United States soldiers were not in any way safe in large cities, with guerrilla groups and Mexican citizens infiltrating and attacking United States soldiers who left the safety of the United States barracks, who walked alone down city streets, or who ventured into drinking establishments alone. The worst of these attacks would actually happen within Mexico City itself. Now this brings us to our next section, the United States atrocities against Mexican citizens. I have to say, this is very much a trigger warning right now, because there are a lot of very tough subjects to discuss coming up in this section. So, trigger warning ahead. So, while they condemned the mistreatment of the Mexican civilian populace, both Zachary Taylor and Winfield Scott practiced a policy of punishing the civilian populace for the actions of Mexican guerrilla groups by punishing entire communities or making the mayors of entire communities punish civilians if they did not stop guerrilla attacks. In addition to this, when the city of Veracruz refused to surrender, Winfield Scott ordered the indiscriminate bombardment of homes, churches, and schools within Veracruz. An estimated 5 to 600 Mexican civilians would die as a result of this bombardment. Many more would be forced to leave Veracruz with no food and inadequate clothing. Then, uh, after after Captain Samuel Hamilton Walker and 12 Texas Rangers were killed in a skirmish, United States officer Joseph Lane would order his men to avenge the dead Texas Rangers by sacking the town of Huamantla on October 9th, 1847 CE. In addition to this, many United States soldiers and volunteers would begin committing crimes against civilians, such as robbery, rape, and murder. This was done for reasons including simple boredom, anti Catholic views, and racism. It was estimated that the United States soldiers killed at least 100 civilians, with the majority of them being killed by the 1st Texas Mounted Volunteers commanded by Colonel John C. Hayes. Okay, so with now we're going to take a look at some personal accounts of these atrocities, some first-hand accounts, if you will. Now, I will say that there are first-hand accounts from Mexico itself, but they are unfortunately not easily accessible as they are only accessible in person in the National Archives of Mexico itself, something I'm not able to do at this moment, but I am able to access the first-hand accounts from United States sources. And these are just as important as the sources from Mexico. In fact, these corroborate the first-hand accounts from Mexican sources. So, with that, we're going to first take a look at Ulysses S. Grant's personal account of these atrocities, specifically looking at an excerpt from a letter sent by Ulysses S. Grant to his wife Julia that reads, and I quote, since we have been in Matamoros, a great many murders have been committed, and what is strange, there seems to be but very weak means made use of to prevent frequent repetitions. Some of the volunteers and about all the Texans seem to think it perfectly right to impose upon the people of a conquered city to any extent, and even to murder them where the act can be covered by the dark, and how much they seem to enjoy the acts of violence too. I would not to pretend to guess the number of murders that have been committed upon the persons of poor Mexicans and our soldiers since we have been here, but the number would startle you. And then we have the George G. Meade's personal account of the atrocities. Specifically an excerpt of a letter sent by George Gordon Meade to his wife Margareta, that reads, and I quote, this place is said to contain many wealthy and agreeable families, but the fears of the assault caused them all to fly to Saltillo and other places in the neighborhood of the city. None has as yet returned, for the volunteers have made themselves so terrible by their previous outrages as to have inspired the Mexicans with perfect horror of them. Until they are assured of their security, they will not return from their hiding places. And then we have one of the most harrowing of the accounts, which is Samuel Chamberlain's personal account of the atrocities, specifically an excerpt from his book, memoir, titled My Confession, that reads, and I quote, hearing more shots away up in the mountain, General Wool ordered Sergeant Clifford to proceed with the guard to the place of firing and arrest all soldiers he found there. Taking a trot, we reached the steep ascent of the mountain, where we dismounted and led our horses up. Soon we were obliged to leave our horses. 3 men were left in charge, and now we only numbered 9 men and the sergeant. All was quiet. Overhead circled a cloud of zapilitos, or vultures, that would occasionally dart down on something on the ground ahead. We reached the place. We found a greaser shot, scalped but still breathing. The poor fellow held in his hands his rosary and a medal of the Virgin of Guadalupe. Only his feeble motions kept the fierce harpies from falling on him while yet alive. A saber thrust was given him in mercy, and we went at a run. Soon shouts and curses and cries of women and children reached our ears, coming apparently from a cave at the end of the ravine. Climbing over the rocks, we reached the entrance. As soon as we could see in the comparative darkness, a horrid sight was before us. The cave was full of our volunteers yelling like fiends, while on the rocky floor lay over 20 Mexicans, dead and dying in pools of blood. Women and children were clinging to the knees of the murderers and shrieking for mercy. Sergeant Clifford ordered the volunteers, mostly Yell's cavalry, to come out and give themselves up as prisoners, which order was received with shouts of derision and threats of cleaning us out if we interfered. Clifford gave the command, and we dropped behind the rocks and took aim on the foremost ruffians. And when our sergeant again ordered them to file out or we would fire, they became silent, not knowing our strength. Soon a brutal looking Rackensacker advanced towards us, brandishing a huge knife dripping with gore in one hand and a bunch of reeking scalps in the other, and cried out, "Hey, are you regulars? I'm Bill Stamps. We don't a muss with you. We don't. I raised this air har from the dead yellow bellies that had on poor Archie's clothes. I did. Take me to Old Fussy, and I'll be responsible for the whole." With this, the savage cutthroat marched out with a swagger. The soldiers, nicknamed for General Wool, gave a fancy Indian dance and subsided in tears. With curses and threats, more than 100 volunteers filed out of the slaughter pen, and with muzzles of our carbines bearing on them, they solemnly marched down the mountain. We soon met our squadron, who took charge of our prisoners, while the officer of the day ordered us back to the cave with several surgeons. On reaching the place, we could hear the low groans of the dying mingled with the sobs of women and cries of children. A fire was burning on the rocky floor, and threw a faint flickering light on the horrors around. Most of the butchered Mexicans had been scalped. Only 3 men were found unharmed. A rough crucifix was fastened to a rock, and some irreverent wretch had crowned the image with a bloody scalp. A sickening smell filled the place. The surviving women and children sent up loud screams on seeing us, thinking that we had returned to finish the work. No one was punished for this outrage. General Wool, in a general order, reprimanded the Arkansas cavalry, but nothing more was done. The direct cause of the massacre was the barbarous murder of a young man belonging to the Arkansas Regiment. But this murder was undoubtedly committed in retaliation for outrages committed on the women of Agua Nueva Ranch by the volunteers on Christmas Day. So, as you can see by all of these sources that I read, the U.S. soldiers and volunteers were horrific to the Mexican populace during this war. And this is just 3 sources. Now imagine the rest of the sources both that are available both in the United States and in Mexican sources. Now this brings us to our next section, the end of the war. So, outnumbered militarily, facing many continuing internal divisions between factions, and with many large cities of the Mexican heartland, including its capital, being occupied, Mexico could not defend itself in conventional warfare. Yet Mexico did not necessarily have to sign a peace treaty, but could instead continue with long term guerrilla warfare against the United States Army. However, it could not expel the invaders, so negotiating a treaty became more necessary. Meanwhile, in the United States, Polk's wish for a short war of conquest against a perceived weak enemy with no will to fight had turned into a long and bloody conflict in Mexico's heartland. At this point in the war, negotiating a treaty was in the best interest of the United States. And here's all the territories seized by the United States during the Mexican-American War. However, as peace negotiations dragged on, Polk lost confidence in his negotiator, Nicholas Trist, and dismissed him. However, Trist ignored the order and went on to negotiate the end of the war in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo on February 2nd, 1848 CE. In this treaty, Mexico would cede territory including the present day states of California, Nevada, Utah, most of Colorado, New Mexico, and Arizona, a small portion of Wyoming, and a small portion of Oklahoma. In return, Mexico would receive $15 million, less than half the amount the United States previously offered Mexico for the land before the opening of hostilities, and the United States would agree to assume $3.25 million in debts that the Mexican government owed the United States citizens. So, with that in mind, let's briefly go over a big question that a few people might have while watching this video. Why did the United States win the war? Well, overall, the war was a hard fought one with no clear victor for much of the conflict. While the United States was more advanced, the Mexican army was more experienced. In most major battles, the United States Army did poorly until it was able to leverage its superior cannons. In addition to this, the political divisions within the government of the Republic of Mexico and the rebellions by Native American communities constantly undermined the Mexican war efforts. However, despite these issues, the Mexican army had several chances to defeat the United States Army, but chose not to due to lack of supplies. Furthermore, the Mexican army and the civilian populace continuously hampered the war efforts of the United States through the use of guerrilla warfare. In fact, the end of the Mexican army as a cohesive fighting force and the end of the Mexican war effort as a whole did not end until the Mexican army was no longer able to feed itself. Therefore, the United States won the Mexican American War due to a combination of political instability in the Republic of Mexico in the form of political divisions and rebellions, the inability of the Mexican government to provide adequate food for the Mexican army, and the United States' use of more advanced cannons and battles. And here are all the sources I used for this analysis. All these sources came to generally the same conclusion. Now, another thing we need to look at is the casualty estimates of the war. So, by far, the majority of the casualties in the Mexican American War were caused by tropical diseases and accidental deaths. The United States Army only had roughly 1,700 soldiers killed and roughly 4,000 injured in battle. In contrast, the United States Army had roughly 11,000 soldiers die as a result of tropical diseases. The Mexican army lost roughly 5,000 soldiers killed in battle and killed and wounded in battle. In contrast, roughly 20,000 Mexican civilians died in the war as a result of violence, military deaths from disease, and accidental deaths. And here is the source that I got all that information from, or all this information from. All right, now this brings us to our last section, the aftermath of the Mexican American War. First, looking at the United States. So, after the Mexican American War, Zachary Taylor would leverage his victory. Again, it was a stalemate at best, but victory at Buena Vista to win the presidential election of 1848 CE. Then, uh, in addition to this, the acquisition of Mexican territory would lead to white American migration to regions such as California during the California Gold Rush between 1849 and the 1850s CE. Also, another, arguably the biggest effect and aftermath of the Mexican American War and the annexation of Mexican territory, the Native American nations of California and the Southwest would fall prey to genocide at the hands of the United States between 1849 and the 1900s CE, really into the modern era. Also, debates on whether or not chattel slavery, African chattel slavery, should be allowed to spread to the newly annexed territory would result in the Compromise of 1850 CE, which in itself would have be one of the not the only one, but one of the eventual causes of the American Civil War, which we'll get to in a second. Then in 1853 and 1854 CE, the United States would purchase more land from Mexico in the Gadsden Purchase. And then eventually, the continued animosity between abolitionists and white American slavers, as seen with the Compromise of 1850, over the issue of African chattel slavery would eventually result in the outbreak of the American Civil War between 1861 and 1865 CE. Yes, I'm sorry, Lost Causers. As always, I have to point out the American Civil War was most certainly fought because of slavery. With that in mind, an important thing to point out is that veterans of the Mexican American War became the generals who fought in the American Civil War. For example, the Union generals who fought in the Mexican American War include, but are not limited to, Ulysses S. Grant, George G. Meade, George B. McClellan, and Winfield Scott Hancock. And then Confederate generals who fought in the Mexican American War include, but are not limited to, Robert E. Lee, Thomas J. Stonewall Jackson, James Longstreet, and George Pickett of Pickett's Charge fame. Now we need to look at the aftermath of the Mexican American War in the Republic of Mexico. Well, for one thing, following the defeat of the Republic of Mexico in the Mexican American War, Santa Anna would retake the presidency of Mexico and would also be exiled several more times before permanently being overthrown by Benito Juarez and Ignacio Comonfort. And this would happen between 1848 and 1855 CE. Then, despite the United States supplying the Mexican army with weapons to quell the multiple rebellions in Mexico, the caste war would continue for decades, with the Maya creating an independent Maya state of Chan Santa Cruz, which would survive until the 20th century, with the caste war lasting between 1847 and 1915 CE. In addition to this, the Mexican American War would highlight the domestic political conflicts and instability within the Republic of Mexico. This instability would result in a civil war in Mexico between the liberals and conservatives, with the liberals winning the conflict, which would become known as the Reform War, with this war further weakening the Republic of Mexico. And this war would happen between 1857 and 1861 CE. After the Reform War, the French Empire would invade Mexico to force the collection of Mexican debts in the what is known as the Second French Intervention. Weakened from the Mexican-American War, the constant rebellions, and the Reform War, the Republic of Mexico would be defeated and displaced. The French Empire would then install Maximilian of Habsburg as Maximilian the First, the Emperor of the Second Mexican Empire, with this happening between 1861 and 1867 CE. All right, so with that, that brings us to the end of our video. I hope people watching this enjoyed learning about the history uh, of the United States and Mexico. Um, but I really hope that you did not enjoy a lot of the other darker parts, especially the atrocities at the hands of the United States and the brutal subjugation of Native American nations. I know, as always, as I've said in the previous videos, it's odd for me, the person making this video, to say that. However, I'm bringing these subjects to light not for enjoyment, but to educate people because they are far too often overlooked and downplayed. Um, and we can't do that. We need to acknowledge that these events happened so that we can make sure that they never happen again. So, with that, I'm going to end the video. Remember to like, share, and subscribe. And if you want to see me cover any of the subjects that I mentioned in this video in greater detail, please feel free to leave a comment in the comment section. And I hope you all have a good day.